Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce a speaker whose work I've been reading on and off for years with great admiration. Adam Zachary Newton is a university professor and the Ronald P. Stanton Chair in Literature and the Humanities at Yeshiva University, where he's also the former chair of the English department. In addition to numerous articles, essays, and talks, he's published 5 books under the general rubric of the ethics of reading, which, as he writes in another place, seeks a bridge between the disciplines of ethical philosophy and literary studies by proposing a new way to think about the moral realms of risk and responsibility as problems of reading. These books include Narrative Ethics from Harvard University Press, 1995, Facing Black and Jew, Literature as Public Space in 20th Century America from Cambridge, The Fence and the Neighbor, Emmanuel Levinas, Yeshayahu Leibovitz and Israel Among the Nations from SUNY Press, The Elsewhere on Belonging at a Mere Distance from the University of Wisconsin Press, To Make the Hands Impure, Art, Ethical Adventure, The Difficult and the Holy from Fordham. And he's now completing a 6th monograph on the subject of Jewish studies in the academic humanities called Jewish Studies as Counterlife, a report up to the Academy that's coming from Fordham in 2017. And his talk today, which he's maybe pulling out of the bag as we speak, is called The Marginocentric Afterlives of Bruno Schulz and the Migration of Form. So please join me in welcoming Adam Zachary Newton. Before getting started, I'd like to also make a quick thank you to the Departments of Comparative Literature and the Jewish Studies program for sponsoring this visit.
Thanks, John. This is on? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you, English and Comp Lit. Thanks, Ben. I'm honored to be here. Today's presentation takes its point of departure from these. Which are also these. These are the last known artworks of Bruno Schulz. Murals that depict characters from Grimm's fairy tales, created in 1942, the year of his violent death, and rediscovered in 2001. My particular concern today centers on the pathos of such an artifact, which plays out as a temporal event in a place of shifting national and cultural allegiances, chronotopically, as Michal Bakhtin might say. My subject then cuts obliquely across what the Slavist Gary Saul Morson, channeling the great 18th century dramatist philosopher Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, likes to call the bias of the artifact. That is, its text-immanent properties. As Morson expresses this idea, art forms carry inherent predispositions, and we may say that narratives, insofar as they rely on structure, are predisposed to convey a sense of fatalism, determinism, or otherwise closed time. Art forms do this as a function of their poetics. But what about art forms that circulate in or become whipsawed by history, that engender or become the subject of their own narratives? What is their temporal nature? Closed, determined, or aleatory and open? If you know anything about Bruno Schulz's afterlife in literary fiction, by such contemporary authors as Cynthia Ozick, David Grossman, Nicole Krauss, and others, speculations about his lost manuscript, The Messiah, loom extraordinarily large. Yet the lost Schulz that was unearthed in 2001 was not a text at all. A haunting revenant of the Shoah, almost immediately upon discovery, it ceased to be materially intact, and now lives a split identity, marking ruptures in time, in space, and in cultural belonging. The critical space it opens for us centers on the resonance of artifacts in and across time, on previously stranded objects, as the Germanist Erich Santner might say, that have become unexpectedly, albeit only partially, recuperated. It introduces a rupture, appositely enough, between the historicity of texts and, for ends sometimes better, sometimes worse, the textuality, the imposed plots and extrapolated patterns that we call history. Our focus today will be on hard material fact, growing out of some recent work of mine on materiality and the ethics of reading. But there will be some nomenclature, as there must be in these sorts of ceremonies. Should you ask me, therefore, which terms might accompany the particular cards in the tarot deck of literary maps and models that I plan to turn to face up today? I don't know if you read The New Yorker, but there's a recent piece about the tarot deck as literature. Which terms might accompany those particular cards? I could say transnational identity, migrational borders, the geopolitics of traditions and languages. Indeed, these are the very terms that flowed back and forth in email correspondence in last December between myself and Professor Edwards when I provisionally described the parameters for a talk on the wall paintings of Bruno Schulz, whose rediscovery ignited a small geopolitical and transnational firestorm. Such terms, transnational identity, etc., are drawn obviously from a lexicon with which we are, I imagine, pretty familiar. On display, for example, in The Reliable Baedeker by Paul Jay from 2010, Global Matters, the Transnational Turn in Literary Studies. You can also see them, I think, in disguised form in the 2016 presidential campaign. At any rate, for our purposes, they identify a region of internally shifting boundaries, a palimpsest that is Jewish Galicia, Poland, Soviet and post-Soviet Ukraine, that through the migrating form of Schulz's murals discontiguously intersects with an environs many kilometers removed, the western slope of Jerusalem's Mount Herzl. Now, while such terms may work for the Schulz example, like the problem of temporal closure that I began with, they risk producing their own potentially stranding effect, not the kindest fate for an already stranded object. As Morrison puts it by way of explaining another of Bakhtin's coinages, theoretism thinks away the eventness of events, which become secondary rather than primary. And it's the primacy of the event here that I wish to preserve, however we situate or name it theoretically. Before we get to the specificities of that event with its split temporality of 1942-2001, let's journey back to the future for just a moment, to that decade before we were officially after theory, when a version of the theoretism that Bakhtin lamented, his beef actually was with structuralist methodologies of various sorts, yielded some instructive propedeutic formulations. At the very least, they offer us some signposts that the Bruno Schulz example both anticipates and refracts. At any rate, it's the event and the stranded object that read the theory here, not the other way around. One of these formulations belongs to Jacques Derrida, who in 1990 wrote a small book entitled L'autre cap, Suivre la démocratie ajournée, rendered by his English translators as The Other Heading, Reflections on Today's Europe. The title is characteristically Derridian. Number one, the other heading, or cape, as in promontory, that is some alternative course for the Europe to come, guided by some new headland or outcrop by which to orient its movements. And number two, the other than cap, moving without the guidance of a promontory in the first place, guided by something other than a head, whether it's the cap of la capitale, the seat of government, or the cap of le capital, the commerce of goods and money. Will Europe, in short, be able to fulfill its potential by keeping itself open to otherness, to another heading, to the other than cap, to alterity, to what is not ever entirely predictable, like the event in its irreducible heterogeneity and singularity? That's Derrida. When it comes to Bruno Schulz, let it be said, we are dealing with something European, Central European more precisely, that is quite other than cap, a now major modernist from minor and decidedly subaltern origins. Drohobycz a backwater town at the foot of the Carpathians that, as has been said, in the last century or so has changed hands 8 times, now in post-Soviet Ukraine, formerly part of Jewish Galicia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, after World War I, enclosed within the short-lived independent West Ukrainian People's Republic, subsequently taken over between the wars by the Second Polish Republic, occupied thereafter by Nazi Germany, and then, and until its fall in 1991, the USSR. Drohobycz, where Schulz spent almost the entirety of his 50 years, writing letters, drawing, teaching middle school art classes, composing his small but exquisite corpus of modernist short fiction, and last but not least, it now seems, painting fairy tale murals on the walls of a nursery in a Gestapo officer's villa, the patronage for which cost him his life when he was gunned down in a random shooting spree on Black Thursday, November 19th, 1942. No instructive or meaningful heading for Europe's past, present, or future, in other words, could reasonably be taken from such a marginal, decentralized town of historically mixed and polyglot Polish, Ruthenian, and Jewish population that at its height in 2001 reached only 79,000 souls. Or could it? I invoke the figure of Derrida principally because the unstable Europe of l'autre cap in 1991, just after the fall of the Soviet Union and Central Europe's turn to liberal democracy in 1989, 10 years before the advent of the euro, signifies a continent, quote, always on the verge of becoming incontinent, of exceeding its limits, constantly tending to go beyond itself, which is to say, beyond its given borders, end quote. I'm quoting now from an essay by Samuel Weber entitled Mind the Cap, in the volume Europe After Derrida, Crisis and Potentiality. Recent political and military conflict over sovereignty and territorial integrity in Ukraine, along with a surprising new authoritarian and illiberal turn in Central Europe. I'm thinking of Hungary, and most relevantly for us, last fall's election victory of Poland's Law and Justice Party, the PIS, raised troubling specters of Europe's perennial anxiety over boundaries and regions, what they contain, or should contain, and what they can't or don't. The current Syrian refugee conflict is just another turn of that screw. This old new account of Europe is a narrative for which the case of Bruno Schulz's lost and found wall paintings seems almost tailor-made. It's a story that effectively begins in 1942, goes underground for 60 years, and reemerges in that tectonic year of 2001, when somehow the geopolitics of sleepy Ukrainian Drohobycz found itself in the gravitational field of national and cultural imperatives hailing from the elsewhere of Israel. It's also oddly anticipated by Schulz's own philosophy of migrational form, as you can see from fragment 4 in the handout. And by the way, that handout is, I should have said at the beginning, is just something that you can look at or skim while I'm speaking. These are excerpts from Schulz's prose that kind of form an ambient background for what I'll say today. That's fragment number 4. So that's Derrida. A second guidepost is provided for us by the post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha, who cast his own prodigious shadow on the landscape of 1990s theory. Bhabha's much anthologized essay, Dissemination, Time, Narrative, and the Margins of the Modern Nation, for example, begins by asking, quote, how does one write modernity in the event of as the event of the everyday and the advent of the epical, end quote. Both of these, it turns out, the everyday and the epical, are essential components of a Schulz vocabulary from a half century earlier. Bhabha is famous for reading the nation space in relation not only to the defining question of temporality, nations transpire according to contrapuntal or divergent timescapes, but also to constitutive elements he called interstitial, liminal, disjunctive, hybrid, fragmented, supplementary, metonymic, and most relevant of all for our purposes, split. All elements that Schulz's singular work embodied, even and especially rather uncannily after his death. When Baba, in plainer vernacular, writes that the scraps, patches, and rags of daily life must be repeatedly turned into the signs of a coherent national culture, he seems almost to presage the case of the Schulz frescoes. Maybe especially because he belongs to the second rather than the first or the third world. Schulz is a figure who troubles the category of nationalism like few other subaltern artists, athwart any easy polarity of West versus East. At the end of Dissemination, Baba quotes Rudolf Gachet, quote, "Supplements are pluses that compensate for a minus in the origin." Supplements are pluses that compensate for a minus in the origin. The poignant case of Bruno Schulz and his last works could be said to embody that very dynamic of plus-minus, of major-minor, center-margin, culturally particular, and transnational or universal. But I said that Baba's formulation seems almost to presage. And presage, or similar such words that I've used and will use again, like anticipate, allegorize, prefigure, or foreshadow, is an orientation to temporal unfolding that Gary Saul Morson wants us precisely to hold at bay when he warns of the dangers of turning lived, contingent, eventful time into a poetics, spatializing temporality as in a literary text, where the narrative unfolding of incidents completes a pattern or answers to a structure. In the place of poetics, Morson proposes what he calls a tempix. What is or are tempics? A way of reading, says Morson, that takes contingency seriously, that allows time to remain a field rather than being reduced to a line or a point, or misconceived as an arrow or a shadow. Tempix restores the possibility of possibility, which means preserving the eventness of an event before it's locked into temporal sequence or hypostasized into symbol. Another Bakhtin-informed Slavist, Mikhail Epstein at Emory, would call this the province of proteism, where the proto takes the place of both pre and post, as a sign not of temporality but of modality, a prefix of the subjunctive mood that also evokes the figure of Proteus, of elusive form and undetermined future. Tempix and proteism finally circle me back to Schulz. In May 2001, representatives from Yad Vashem, Israel's national memorial to the Shoah and World Research Center on the Holocaust, partially removed a set of wall paintings that after 6 decades of oblivion had been brought to light a scant 3 months earlier in a Drohobycz apartment. These are they. Behind the backs, as it were, of Polish and Ukrainian ministers of culture and art conservators from the National Polish Museum, and through a hastily transacted arrangement with official authorities and the apartment's owners, the artifacts, described as a queen, jesters, horse and carriage, and a self-portrait of Bruno Schulz as the driver, were semi-clandestinely salvaged from their recessed existence. Curated now as wall painting under coercion, 3 fragments are on display at Yad Vashem, while a smaller portion of the original wall, backgrounds, borders, and landscapes, fittingly, remain anchored, Schulz-like, in Drohobycz, in the newly established Bruno Schulz Museum, housed within the gymnasium where Schulz taught art classes, now a pedagogical college named after the 19th century Ukrainian author Ivan Franko. If, in the words of one critic, Schulz's entire universe is premised on the vitality of hidden life and encrypted purpose, the episode of the murals would seem eerily, quasi-allegorically, to bear that very principle out. For as Schulz himself will seem to have presaged, and there's that word again, everything diffuses beyond its borders, remains in a given shape only momentarily, leaving the shape behind at its first opportunity. The migration of forms is the essence of life. The migration of forms is the essence of life. And you can see, as I said, you can see that in fragment 4 and some of the other fragments intimate the same notion of encrypted purpose in the migration of forms. Whether or not artists will or even should have the last word about their own work, contingency seems to have conspired here to throw its voice while configuring a plot all its own. Morson's tempix-oriented approach privileges literary works that convey a sense of open and asymmetrical time. His examples are Dostoevsky novels, Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, Chekhov's Three Sisters. The Idiot, for example, by Dostoevsky is described by him as a novel as a thought experiment because it leaves open the possibilities of alternative outcomes, a feature Morson calls side-shadowing. Although, as far as I know, Morson never mentions him. Bruno Schulz, if I may, foreshadows that insight quite uncannily. Look at fragment 6. And then there is this highly improper manipulation of time, these indecent dealings, sneaking into its mechanism at the back and tampering dangerously with its precarious secrets. Sometimes one wants to bang on the table and shout at the top of one's voice, "Enough of this, keep your hands off time. Time is untouchable. It is not possible to aggravate time. In space, you may go wherever you please, you may turn somersaults, fall head over heels, leap from star to star, but for the love of God, leave time alone." Has a reader ever heard about the parallel strands of time in two-track time? Yet such branch stretches of time do exist, a little illegal to be sure and problematic, but when carrying such contraband as ours, such supernumerary, unclassifiable events, one cannot be too particular. And at some point in our story, we shall attempt to take such a branch turning, a siding, and shunt this illegal history into it. That's Schulz. As far as the now discontiguous wall paintings are concerned, in the ensuing controversy over their rightful home, Ukrainian, Polish, Jewish, Israeli, world Republican claims to Schulz's art directly competed, each trying to lock down its borders and legislate continence or containment. Unlike the spatial construct developed by literary historians Marcel Corny-Pope and John Neubauer, the East European Marginocentric city, with its ethnic and linguistic porosity, shared boundaries, hybridized social relations and cultural traditions, the agitated rivalry in this case spoke instead of appropriation and surrogacy, forced removal and usurpation, as the murals themselves migrated improbably from obscure margin to conflicted foreground. As a sort of cautionary fable about open time and contingency, their belated discovery and subsequent redisappearance, it took 8 years until they were finally exhibited, also plucks a persistent Schulzian chord about genealogical loss. All discussions of them, polemical or otherwise, emphasize the irony of loss that will forever attach itself to these artworks, which, having been lost, then found, were in their wholeness lost again. They exist now only as disjunctive and discontiguous fragments, scraps and sections, veritable emblems of liminality, figures minus a background, recovered art objects rendered extraterritorial. If supplements or pluses compensating for a minus in the origin, these are stranded now forever between plus and minus. It occurred to me this morning while I was reading this over that there's another obvious, almost too obvious context in which to put this. That would have to do with those numerous cases and controversies involving artifacts or artworks that belong in one place, their putative home, and reside in another, The literally classic example would be the Parthenon structures, called the Elgin marbles, which the Greek government still insists be repatriated to Greece by the British Museum. I actually looked at the British Museum website this morning and found this description of that division. The Acropolis Museum allows the part which is kind of distant analog to the Schulz example. The Acropolis Museum allows the Parthenon sculptures that are in Athens, approximately half of what survives from antiquity, to be appreciated against the background of ancient Greek and Athenian history. The Parthenon structures in London are an important representation of ancient Athenian civilization in the context of world history. The trustees are convinced that the current division allows different and complementary stories to be told about the surviving sculptures, highlighting their significance within world culture and affirming the place of ancient Greece among the great cultures of the world. Obviously, where the Schulz example is concerned, the special conditions of history before and after the Shoah, and the singularity of Bruno Schulz himself as an author-artist, as well as these contested artifacts, draw a kind of magic circle around them. So although they bear, I think, a resemblance to the example I just gave and a number of others, I think they're all but unique in their singularity. Now, a couple of minutes back, I spoke of reading an artwork tempically as an event, of preserving the eventness of an event before absorbing it into a synchronic finished structure. 2 points that I want to make at this point can guide the rest of our discussion. The first is captured by the series of excerpts from Schulz's writing that I have assembled in the handout, which on the model of the wall paintings themselves I call fragments, because I've taken them out of context. These represent the Bruno Schulz you may be more familiar with and who better suits the lineaments of the Luncheon for the Comparative Literature Department, and maybe Jewish Studies. Schulz the writer and transmogrifier, Schulz the innovator in Polish, European, and more genuinely 20th century modernism. Schulz the exponent, quietly in the background to be sure, of what Baba would call writing the nation. I'm thinking particularly of his literary essays, Republic of Dreams, about Galicia, and the formation of legends about Józef Piłsudski, the first Marshal of Poland during the interwar years. Writing the nation. Except which nation? Which are his national or perhaps more properly transnational affinities? What the legal controversy around the murals brought to the fore was a different set of questions, and I'll state them baldly. Who owns Bruno Schulz? Exactly to which constituency or federation does he belong? Where is his proper home? Think in this vein of Bakhtin's famous statement from one of his late essays. The most intense and productive life of culture takes place on the boundaries of its individual areas and not in places where these areas have become enclosed in their own specificity. Think of all those modernist and contemporary writers for whom descriptors like exilic, diasporic, migratory, and borderline come into situational play. Even if, as in Schulz's case, we're talking about conditions of internal exile and a diasporic imaginary, about margins and borders within as much as between places. Since these are questions that also involve literary history, consider that in a book dear to Ben Schreier's heart, Ruth Weiss's The Modern Jewish Literary Canon, the space you'd expect Bruno Schulz to occupy is conspicuously voided, in stark contrast to a writer with whom he's so often compared, for better or worse, Franz Kafka. For Weiss, Schulz is extra-canonical, Jewishly extraterritorial, Jewish by birth and ethno-racial filiation, but not a contributor to or an exponent of Jewish literature. So, within which canon does the legacy of, or should the legacy of Bruno Schulz reside? And mutatis mutandis, who has the right to these murals? Poland, Ukraine, Israel, metonymically embodied by Yad Vashem. Now, it doesn't help that Schulz himself, in expectation of marrying his Polish Catholic fiancée, took out an advertisement in the Drohobycz newspaper in 1938, formally disaffiliating himself from his co-religionists. He was in the vanguard of Polish literary modernists. If you read Polish, Schulzian prose is like the author himself, is absolutely singular. There's no other Polish prose like it. And yet his elective affinities were with the likes of Rilke and Mann. His ambiguous status as a national or cultural subject is rather nicely captured by one of his commentators, Maurice Nadeau, who wrote, Bruno Schulz, born an Austrian, lived as a Pole, and died as a Jew, missing the chance to become Russian. When you spend some time with the corpus of secondary literature and occasional pieces on Schulz, there was, for instance, a celebrated exchange in the New York Review of Books between a group of Penn writers protesting Yad Vashem's act of cultural appropriation on the one hand, and a group of Israeli and American Jewish sympathizers defending that act as an obligation and a right on the other. You encounter the full range of identitarian claim and counterclaim. I thought I would just read two excerpts. This is from a letter to the editor in 2002 by Aaron Appelfeld and a number of other Israeli writers. There is little memory of the Jews or of the Holocaust in Drohobycz, and little that the municipality could do to correct the situation. Perhaps through Yad Vashem, to which visitors from all faiths and nationalities come and will continue to come, the memory of Drohobycz and its Jews will not perish. And in the repost to that letter says the following. Placed in Yad Vashem, the frescoes will of course speak to us of radical evil, just as many objects of art around the world could be exhibited within a specific moral context. Placed properly in Drohobycz, they would speak much more powerfully, not only of, again, the lost, dimly remembered world of a rich and diverse culture, but also of a noble effort to bridge the chasms separating us from the past. Those interested in Schulz's work should remember that Schulz was above all a writer, perhaps the greatest short story writer in Polish. Nearly all his work is set in Drohobycz. Is it not the best homage to him to salvage some part of the world he loved in situ? So obviously the controversy here is about where best to keep or place these artworks. According to one affronted defender of Schulz's claim on Jewish peoplehood and vice versa, Bruno Schulz did in fact write in Polish, but he was no Pole. And according to another, Bruno Schulz lived as a Jew and died as a Jew. Maurice Nadeau's aphorism makes the more nuanced case for these affiliative forms of belonging. Schulz's liminality, perched on the boundary of Jewishness, of Polishness, and national belonging, of literary modernism, of 20th century geopolitics and the engines of history, nevertheless remains idiosyncratic and extreme. A test case, a limit case, for a second world transnationalism within European borders. And this is where Derrida's trope of an autre cap becomes especially relevant. If the first point is about the provisionality of national belonging, the first point that we can talk about, its necessarily fragmented interstitial character. The second point is about what we might, after Adorno and Benjamin, constellate as categories of authenticity and aura. I'm thinking in that vein of a superlative essay by Stephen Greenblatt called Resonance and Wonder. You may have read it, which proposes two very different models for exhibiting works of art, as indeed Schulz's murals are now on permanent exhibition at Yad Vashem. Here's how Greenblatt explains the distinction. By resonance, I mean the power of the displayed object to reach out beyond its formal boundaries to a larger world, to evoke in the viewer the complex dynamic cultural forces from which it has emerged and for which it may be taken by a viewer to stand. By wonder, on the other hand, I mean the power of the displayed object to stop the viewer in his or her tracks, to convey an arresting sense of uniqueness, to evoke an exalted attention. End quote. The virtues of resonance, defined this way, take us back full circle to where I began, the pathos or fate of objects in and across time, and it's where I'll now conclude. Greenblatt talks about preserving the openness of objects, their intrinsic precariousness, what Morrison would call their contingency and eventness, something which become especially visible when the object itself is wounded, when it bears the marks of human touch, or is witness to the menace of history. In the latter case, they indicate those hands through which an object has passed. And yet, just think of the layers that accrete around these images, pried off and wrenched from their autochthonous context, which immediately prior to a decades-long dormancy in what was to become a kitchen pantry might serve as perhaps the very definition of an upside-down and maddened world, the nursery of an Einsatzkommando officer who, when he wasn't committing acts of barbarism, commissioned hapless Bruno Schulz to paint fairy tale images for his children. Where do these images belong? Where they were, or the place from which they've been rescued? Or the place to which they've now been transported? An essay on Schulz that offers a critical legal perspective on the murals controversy and what it may say about proprietary claims of ownership at one point describes them as crime scene evidence. But it also speculates in a more Benjaminian vein about the possibility that Yad Vashem's rescue of the murals from their haunted obscurity in Ukraine, whatever legal and diplomatic questions it raises, might also have rendered them and Bruno Schulz an inadvertent service. And I'd like you to pay close attention to this. Quote, whether the act itself, a number of Poles and Ukrainians alike called it plunder, brigandage, desecration, actually shattered the aura of the work and freed it from the burdens of the past, its original locations, and unleashed its true potential, emancipating it from its given, perhaps constraining context. Whether the act actually shattered the aura of the work and freed it from the burdens of the past, its original locations, and unleashed its true potential, emancipating it from its given, perhaps constraining context. This is also Greenblatt's point about resonance, and it dovetails with Morrison's Bakhtinian notion of tempics, placing works in the context of the open eventfulness of time, letting them happen, allowing a margin for their surplus, their remainder, for contingencies that can't be neatly fitted within an artificially integrative gestalt. And the question is, which is the right gestalt? This, I think, is one lesson, one moral, if you will, of the murals. Greenblatt says this: I'm fascinated by the signs of alteration, tampering, and even deliberate damage that many museums try simply to efface. First and most obviously, the act of displacement that is essential for the collection of virtually all older artifacts and most modern ones. Pulled out of chapels, peeled off church walls, removed from decayed houses, given as gifts, seized as spoils of war, stolen or purchased more or less fairly by the economically ascendant from the economically naive. Quote, end quote. Obviously, the Schulz murals foreground such acts of displacement, and as such, represent, I think, a limit case, as well as a small fable about transnational identity. When originally painted, the fairy tale images had already migrated the forms of fellow Drohobychers and Schulz's own eccentric visage. This was one of the most subversive things about them, that Schulz actually painted his fellow Jews onto these images of Grimm's fairy tales in the nursery of Felix Landau. 60 years later, they drifted materially all over again. Their tampered state is the very sign and proof of that very differently conflicted migration of forms. Their limit also marks their pathos. But now, having reached my own limit, I think it's time to cross the border from monologue into the more open and contingent, freer space of dialogue. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Before John speaks, we were talking a little bit earlier about a scene from Dodgeball, where the tagline for which is, if you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball. And the dodgeball team gets a bunch of wrenches thrown at them. So here's your chance to throw wrenches at me. But I'll say before question period starts that I'm the father of a 3-month-old and I'm severely underslept. John?
Well, I was gonna say, this is something of a onesie of a question rather than a wrench at all. But given the sort of internal paradox of the propedeutically auto-allegorizing artifact, I write that down to get it out. But I mean, which is to say that the kind of these internal and non-dialectical paradoxes of preservation and destruction, of fragmentation and singularity, right, which maintain, that preserve the evental quality while maintaining the openness that is supposed to be not an act of preservation. And all those kind of paradoxes, which are, as we talked about beforehand, the paradoxes of the archive industry as well. I'm wondering, in that context, if there's a way in which what you're describing as pathos is actually not a kind of fidelity. And again, if I can bracket all the apparatus under that idea, I'm wondering if you could comment about two moments of fidelity that only briefly come into the talk, but which strike me as very important. And one is to think about the figuration here of the murals in terms of fidelity and all the problematics that would incorporate, rather than sort of willing subversion into them too. I mean, how do we read these or look at these images as some kind of fidelity? The fidelity perhaps of inserting, installing certain kinds of portraiture, for example. And the second part of that is to think about the fidelity that you're advocating, let's say, sort of on the critical front, right, of trying to maintain, let's say, the kind of irresolvable paradox of place. It involves a different medium, I would suggest, which is the critical medium and sort of the medium of the press, or at least of the problematic itself. So could you comment upon those two possibilities of
really interesting question, which I hope I understand. And I'm thinking quickly, and a number of things come to mind. And the first is a kind of self-criticism, and I realize that it probably behooves me to be precise about what I keep calling the event. And the interesting thing here is the event is multiple. There's the event of Schulz painting these wall paintings in the first place, kind of diabolical commission by his Nazi patron. These really, under a sentence of imminent death, Schulz was asked to paint Grimm's fairy tales for Felix Landau's children. So there's that event, the creation of the work. There's the event that's kind of laminated on top of that event, which is the rediscovery of the murals, which was momentous because they, there was a sort of legend that these existed, but they hadn't been unearthed. They were unearthed. A filmmaker named Benjamin Geisler, and that's him, filmed the excavation, and shortly after he made this movie, the frescoes were transported by the representatives of Yad Vashem, which is the third event, which is sort of laminated on top. Their forced migration. which raises a kind of a question about multiple fidelities or competing fidelities. So there's the fidelity to the fact that the structure in which these murals were painted is extant, and in post-Soviet Ukraine could conceivably have been turned into a Bruno Schulz museum, as there were plans to do. There's the very different notion of fidelity that Yad Vashem espouses, which is to be faithful to the historicity of the Shoah. These works belong rightly in a place where they're valued, not in a place where they were hidden and the subject of depredation to begin with. Am I getting close to the question? So, but fidelity, is a screw that has surprising turns. So these pictures here, in this second website that I have, this is from Benjamin Geisler's own archive that he's created online. Benjamin Geisler is a German filmmaker who, and he has created a replica of the room in Drohobycz in which so he's reproduced the kitchen pantry in which the murals were painted. He's also created a kind of homage to them separately, and he's also memorialized their brigandage. That's what this paper is. That's what this photo illustrates. As a way of kind of being faithful not only to the objects themselves, but to the crime that he feels, and many others felt, was committed in their being prized out of their natural environments. So that's what I find so uncanny about this multiply significant event. And I would distinguish it, as I said at the beginning of the talks, from Bruno Schulz's writings, which, as literary texts, know no boundaries, are necessarily migrational. They're migrational from author to reader, and in all of those transactions and in readerships, but they're migrational in the way that literary texts need to be and necessarily are. These are objects of a very different sort, and raise and really kind of crystallize notions of competing fidelity that I think are what make them so interesting. Does that? Yeah.
Two questions. First one goes like this. I'd really like you to talk a little bit more about that notion of openness. I'm thinking about the way that you're using event, and in my mind I have to confess I sort of have Atridge's literature as event, as a kind of companion piece to what you're talking about, which is the art piece and the openness of the art piece to event. The problem for me comes when we look at where it's going. So at the end of your paper, you turn towards this notion that there's a kind of openness in their unhoming, in one way, from this environment, right? But that stands very much outside the quite closeness of Yad Vashem's narrative. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. Like they're going to a place, right? They're not going to an open narrative.
Right. No, I mean, that's a great question. It's not only that they're going to a place, they're going inside a plot. They're being inserted inside a sort of meta-narrative about the Shoah, about redemption, about rescue. And in fact, unashamedly, that's the Yad Vashem position, that this museum is the only rightful home for these orphaned works, which are the as commissioned by by the Nazis are a kind of metonymy of evil. And what else should their fate be but rescue and salvage? But to do that, in fact, right, to do that, and it's not only that, but to curate them, and this is in fact there's an irony here in this. This is a press release from Yad Vashem, and the irony is, the Republic of Dreams is a luminous essay by Schulz. It's this sort of spiritualization of Galicia, and it's sort of it's consonant with the genius of his fiction, and it's a wonderful flight of fancy about Galicia or Drohobycz as a sort of spiritual place, which is in deep and discordant relationship with with the kind of closed and bordered notions of identity that I think are at work in Yad Vashem's rescue of the wall painting, if that makes sense. And so the title of the exhibit is Bruno Schulz Wall Painting Under Coercion, right? So they've been, in being titled that way, they've been inserted into a narrative, and the narrative itself saves the objects. I mean, I think that's the rationale. They're now safely embedded in a story. And my thought about that is precisely along the lines, I think, that you're suggesting, which denies them, a kind of aleatory, contingent freedom, which they're being found in Drohobycz, filmed as found, sort of makes visible. If the functionaries from Yad Vashem had not clandestinely removed them, we would obviously we would be having a different discussion about the wall paintings themselves, which should have simply been rediscovered in Drohobycz, which is where they remain. But that's not what happened to them. And one could say, well, that's a different sort of closure. That's a different sort of narrative where they've been left. They've been left in situ, and as such remain stranded. As sort of orphaned, not because they've been damaged and transported, but orphaned in that they're sort of the remainder, the surplus of Bruno Schulz's creative output. But that's not necessarily a narrative that I would sort of subscribe to. So if I'm no, exactly. But so there are different kinds of orphaning, different kinds of closure, different kinds of contingency, different kinds of bordering, of cross-bordering. I mean, I find the multiple events here sort of endlessly fascinating to me. Even if we were to step aside from all of the kind of fancy transnational theoretical language and just talk about them against the background of Schulz's oeuvre. What happened to the murals uncannily reenacts many of the things that happen in Schulz's stories, which makes them really poignant or piquant as migrational forms. Right, exactly. Right.
Sorry.
So no, thanks. That's a great question, and I hope I yeah, okay.
So a
Hi.
question. So in your sort of recap of Stephen Greenblatt's nice essay on resonance and wonder, in his section there on talking about museums and museum spaces, and of course is making me think anyway of Barbara Giblet's work on destination culture and that sort of thing, and kind of the careful museal curation of non-local cultures in a sort of experiential type of manner. I don't really know anything about the Yad Vashem Museum itself, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the placement of that museum vis-a-vis its own landscape and what's happening there, and the the role of artworks like Bruno Schulz's in that space.
Right. So that's a really, really interesting question, and so the Yad Vashem fills a double purpose. It has its own sort of, I don't know, not split identity, but doubled identity. It is Israel's memorial to the Holocaust, but it's also a museum. And those functions are congruent, and sometimes, though, they're at odds with one another. There are certainly other exhibits of art about the Holocaust, art that was generated in and during the Holocaust, sort of drawings from Theresienstadt, for example. This exhibit, though, is its own sort of autonomous edition, and it is curated in this way, and which, as I was saying in response to the earlier question, links it to a whole set of other objects and a kind of a cultural tapestry which it's kind of woven into. Greenblatt's article, which I really recommend to you, is, if I didn't explain it sufficiently, is about how museums exhibit works, and how they either enclose works within a kind of numinous aura of art, which compels the viewer into a kind of an obeisance. On the one hand, and exhibits that show the artwork with its with sort of literally with the handprints of humans on it, marks of its being transferred from one place to another, really as a kind of resisting the notion that art transcends place and historicity. And his preference, I mean, it's an interesting essay because it's dialectical, and he's not recommending resonance over wonder. He's actually asking us to kind of maintain a double vision about art generally. But I think the terms actually work for the Schulz example. Although I don't know that they're anything that we can really wonder about in the way that that he defines them, that term, because now they're so sort of resonant on levels that Schulz obviously could not have anticipated. They're sort of contaminated texts because of that, or contaminate.
And I was thinking on a really material level as well, the act of kind of chiseling these pieces out of a piece of plaster somewhere and then putting them on top of pieces of plaster that someone else's hands put up.
Right. No, that's really smart. I mean, which merely, I mean, is a sort of photo negative to their having been painted in the first place. They're not frescoes properly. Because they don't use a fresco technique. They are wall paintings. Schulz, you may know, was a draftsman, and his first published work was a collection of drawings. So he's as famous for his artwork as he is for his fiction. And these are the last pictorial artworks that he composed. But to think about and sort of to think together the activity of composition in the first place, the painting on in this place on these walls, and then the counter text to that, which is the excavating, clandestinely too. I mean, it happened at night.
And the conditions of labor. I mean, I'm trying to imagine who is actually building the museum.
Absolutely, right. Yeah. So does that?
Great. Well, I'm afraid we're already over time, so thank you all for joining us. And